Greetings and welcome to Session 8, Understanding Chord Names. My name is Jerry, and I'd like to begin by reminding you from Session 1 that the primary goal of this learning series, How Chords Are Formed and Used, for absolute beginners, is obviously to get you forming chords as soon as possible. As you can see in our map, this will remind us where we have been, where we are, and where we are going. And we are now at our destination session to becoming a true chordologist. It may seem like a long road to get here, but in reality, the first 7 sessions combined have provided a little over 4 hours of instruction. So it seems that a half-day total of concentration and dedication is a very short amount of time of learning time to gain a lifetime of knowledge for understanding how to form hundreds of chords. And the good news is that the information you've already learned never changes. So from previous sessions, you should have a good understanding about note names, note intervals, note position numbers, semitone count numbers, chord formulas, and chord types, and how they all fit into the puzzle of forming chords. And as you might imagine, there are still a few scattered pieces you should know about in being able to confidently identify and make sense of chord names with ease and efficiency. And yet, as an absolute beginner, chord names may still appear as some foreign language, especially those containing various combinations of letter abbreviations, multiple numbers, and accidentals. For example, a B minor 7th flat 5 chord might still look intimidating. But we'll clear that up in this session, as there is much order and logic to chord naming that first meets the eye. You might even say that chord naming is centered on learning a, quote, decoding language to unravel its cryptic look. I'll demonstrate by using a variety of chord type examples where you'll learn the similarities and differences in how chords are formed and named. By session's end, you'll have the knowledge you need to, quote, decode any chord, thus reducing your anxiety when seeing what might look to be a complicated chord. And by using semitone count numbers to actually form and play any chord, you'll look like a chord pro to your musician friends while doing it. I'll finish this session by demonstrating several examples on the piano. First, let's take a look at the 3 parts or sections of a chord name to see how they are organized. In part 1, the first section of any chord name begins with some specific music note letter that could be any one of 18 possible choices. This would include any of the 7 white note names, any of the 10 enharmonic black note names, and the 1 white B note that also has an enharmonic C-flat name. And typically, chord names are written in their root or tonic version, where the chord letter name is the starting note. For example, any type of C chord starts with a C note. The second section of any chord name is located immediately to the right of the note letter and is the area that defines which type of triad it is, where all chords begin their life. This section identifies one, but only one, of the following possible triad chord types by using abbreviations including the uppercase M for a major triad, the lowercase m for minor, DIM for diminished, AUG for augmented, and SUS2 or 4 for suspended. If the second section is left empty, then always assume it to be a major triad chord. Notice that these triad chord type abbreviations serve as a, quote, code for the chord formula note position numbers, and they obviously do not appear in the chord name itself. So as you decode or decipher the chord type abbreviation, then you can look up its chord formula in note position numbers and then convert them to their semitone count numbers. Again, to repeat and clarify, The major triad chord type is officially abbreviated with a capital letter M. However, this M abbreviation is rarely used, and instead, 99% of the time, no letter abbreviation is used at all, and in fact, a space for it doesn't even exist. Thus, when you see no letter abbreviation or no symbol or no space immediately after a note letter name, always assume it to be the major triad chord type. Always. And as far as pronouncing the chord name of the major triad chord type, the more accurate verbiage would be to say, for example, it is a C major chord rather than just a C chord. However, most musicians only call it a C chord, so you need to know this. In Part 3, this third section of any chord name is beyond and to the right of the triad chord type section, and contains information that is related to the extended chord types of 7, 9, 11, and 13th chords, including any other chord quality information if applicable. So for chord names that include numbers and or flat or sharp symbols, this is the section where they will appear. And as a reminder, numbers appearing in this section identify extended chord names and or identify individual note position number notes. This will make more sense with the examples coming up in this session. But no matter, remember that none of these numbers in a chord name are semitone count numbers, as these are a different set of numbers that we use to form the chord and the count to form the chord, not actually in the chord name itself. I think one of the best ways to understand how chords are named is to look and listen to examples on how the decoding process works, which is what we're about to do. Let's begin with the Group 1 triad chord types that we studied in Session 7 so I can discuss a few important naming points. Specifically, let's see how the most common chord type of all, the C major chord, is named. And remember, most musicians unknowingly or lazily omit saying the word major and just use the note letter name, that of C in this example, or whatever, to name the chord. As stated earlier, Part 1 of any chord's name identifies the letter name of the chord, which also indicates the chord's root or starting position note. For example, the C note letter represents the chord letter name and the chord starting note. Thus, we know that the C note will be our first note in this C chord example as we see here. Now, looking in Part 2 of this example, we see that there is no letter abbreviation for the triad chord type, which means it is assumed to be a major triad chord type, although I left a blank box to help keep things organized. Having decoded this information, we can now look up the major chord type's chord formula, finding it to be note positions numbers 1, 3, and 5. And I've abbreviated NPN for chart purposes here to represent note position numbers. At this point, we can convert these note position numbers to their equivalent semitone count numbers of 0, 4, 7 that we have now seen many times in previous sessions and examples. And I have included both sets of triad formula numbers into the lower left table so we can see them, since they never actually appear in the chord name itself. I have also included a quote reminder table in the lower right corner to show the equivalent alignment numbers between the note position numbers, again abbreviated NPN, and semitone count numbers, which again never change. For Part 3 in this example chord, there is no further chord type or note quality information to decode. So to conclude and get us to the actual notes we need to form and play, we now convert these chord formula numbers into the note letters of C, E, and G by listing them in the last row as you see here. So when I play these three notes simultaneously, I know with confidence that I am playing the C major chord. No exceptions, never changes. It's that simple. Now let me explain the chord name of the second most commonly used chord type of all, the minor chord. But this time, let's use note letter E to form an E minor chord just to mix things up. Thus, in Part 1, we see in this example that the E note will be our letter chord name, and therefore the start note of forming this chord. Really, nothing else to learn here. Now, looking in the Part 2 triad chord type section, we see that there is the lowercase m abbreviation, which is identifying itself as a minor triad chord. When we look up the minor chord formula, we find it to be note position numbers 1, flat 3, 5, and the semitone count numbers of 0, 3, 7, as seen in the left table here. Now at least we can see them, since they, remember, do not appear in the chord name itself. As we observe the Part 3 section, we see that there is no additional chord type or note quality information to decode. So to conclude, we can go back to the lower left table and convert the chord formula numbers into chord note letters by inserting them in the last row as seen. Now, using the semitone count numbers to form this E minor chord, we see that the first note letter is an E note, which is the 0 count, the 3 count is the G note, and then the 7 count is the B note. Thus, an E minor chord is formed and played simultaneously with the notes E, G, and B, no matter what octave they are played in. No exceptions, and they never change. It's that simple. In Part 1 of this diminished triad chord, we see the B-flat note letter name to be the chord name and the start note as usual. That's it. In Part 2, we can see the abbreviation DIM, which is short for diminished, which is our triad chord type. In looking up this diminished chord formula, we find it to be note position numbers 1, flat 3, and flat 5, or the semitone count numbers of 0, 3, 6. As before, I have placed both sets of these triad formula numbers into the bottom left table. And again, looking in Part 3, we see no other chord type or note quality information provided, so there is nothing else to decipher. As usual, we can convert the semitone count numbers into note letters to form this chord. We see that the first note letter is a B-flat note, which is a 0 semitone count. The 3 semitone count is a D-flat note, and the 6 semitone count is the E note. Thus, a B-flat diminished chord is played with the notes B-flat, D-flat, and E, no matter what octave I want to play them in. No exceptions, and they never change. It's that simple, and I hope that you are now getting the feel of how easy chords can be formed both accurately and efficiently, especially using semitone count numbers. Let's look at one more Group 1 triad chord type before moving on to 4-note chords. As we see in Part 1, the name of this chord begins with the D-flat note, so obviously that becomes the starting note of this chord. In Part 2, we can see the abbreviation SUS, which is short for suspended, which is our triad chord type. Notice also the reminder in the right box, which explains the naming of the two different types of suspended chords. Thus, this example chord only uses the SUS abbreviation, so we assume it to be a suspended 4 chord. And looking up the SUS4, or the sus4 chord as it's commonly called, and when we look up its chord formula, we find it to be note positions 1, 4, and 5, or the semitone count numbers of 0, 5, and 7, as included in the left table. In Part 3, we see there is no other chord type or note quality information provided, since this really is simply a triad chord type. Now converting, we see that the first note letter is a D-flat note, the 0 count, the 5 semitone count is a G-flat note, and the 7 semitone count is an A-flat note. Thus, a D-flat suspended 4 chord is formed with the notes D-flat, G-flat, and A-flat, no matter what octave I want to play them in. No exceptions, and they never change. It's that simple. Sound familiar? The chord we now see is most commonly pronounced as an F7 chord, but is more accurately pronounced as an F dominant 7th chord, my first example of a Group 2 4-note chord. As we see here in Part 1, it shows us that this is an F chord letter name, which is also its starting note. Nothing new or different here. In Part 2, since there is no letter abbreviation provided immediately to the right, we can assume it to be a major triad chord type, which by now you should know to be note position numbers 1, 3, and 5, or semitone count numbers 0, 4, 7, as seen in the lower left table. Now in part 3, we're entering the world of 4-note seventh chords. This is where we will see chord type or note quality information being added to the first 3 triad chord type formula notes, and where naming confusion can begin. So before discussing part 3 in this example, I want to take a sidebar to demystify the confusion between the 2 types of 7th chords that I mentioned in session 7 on how they are formed and named. And in fact, many veteran musicians grapple to understand the differences in the 7th chords that I am about to explain. And after I finish the sidebar conversation specifically about 7th chords, I'll resume and finish part 3 of this F7 or F dominant 7 chord naming example here. To remind you from session 7, the 2 types of 7th chords are officially named the quote dominant 7th chord that I just began explaining a few minutes ago, and the quote major 7th chord. So let me give you the background story about them. Somewhere in time, the word dominant of the dominant 7th chord name was dropped, thus leaving only the number 7 in the chord name, as in F7 or C7. But this is where the chord naming confusion begins, so listen carefully. When you see the number 7 appearing in a chord name, again like F7, C7, E flat 7, or whatever, you must realize that this number 7 is not actually the note position number 7 as the chord name suggests, but it is actually the flat 7 note position number, always. And when you'll see how big a deal this is as we continue. So to help distinguish the dominant 7 from its sister major 7th chord, we must use the abbreviation MAJ7, major 7, which is the quality of the chord name that does use the actual note position number 7, as you see in our slide. To say this another way, a dominant 7th chord, that is an abbreviated 7 like C7, F7, must be formed using the flat 7 note position number, which is a semitone count number of 10, and is not the actual note position number 7, which uses a semitone count number of 11. That is reserved for the major 7th chord. So the actual 7 note position number then is used to form the major 7th chord. So these are then the 2 chord note and chord naming differences that give us then 2 distinct sounding chord types, the dominant 7th chord and the major 7th chord. And just to finish this 7th chord naming story, you might be asking, why was the word dominant dropped in the first place? The answer, as best as I can determine, is that music composers and music professionals long ago may have been looking for brevity to simplify and gain space on an already crowded sheet music. Or maybe musicians just got lazy. But for whatever reasons, no one likely realized the shortened, quote, 7th chord naming version would create such a misunderstanding. And although there is only one note difference between these 2 7th chords, it is this one note difference that makes them 2 distinctly different chord types, and thus chord names. To clarify, as mentioned earlier, the more technically correct and clearer way to refer to this abbreviated and commonly used F7 chord or C7 or E flat 7 would be to express them as an F dominant 7th or a C dominant 7th or whatever, and then therefore abbreviate in writing as an F DOM 7. This verbiage then would go a long way in helping eliminate the chord naming confusion between it and its sister major 7th chord name. The good news is that most musicians did and do actually play the correct flat 7 note in the so-called 7th chords, because they were likely taught the 7th chord using finger shapes rather than actually being knowledgeable about note position numbers themselves or how or why chords are named the way they're named. So what's the point here? Well, if more musicians understood the facts of how chords are named, fewer misunderstandings and debates could be avoided. But more importantly, musicians could enjoy more efficiency and transpositions in forming chords on demand. Now let's resume our example at hand and complete the decoding process of this F7 chord name. In looking in the Part 3 Chord Types and Qualities section, we now know the number 7 that appears in its name is actually formed with the flat 7 note position number note. Again, this is for the F dominant 7th, or abbreviated F7th chord. And again, using the semitone count numbers to form this chord, we see that the first note letter is an F note, which is a 0 semitone count. The 4 count is an A note. The 7 semitone count is a C note. And the 10 semitone count is an E flat note. Thus, an F dominant 7, or when we get lazy, people just call it an F7 chord, is formed with the notes F, A, C, and E flat, no matter what octave I play it in. No exceptions, and they never change. It's that simple. Now, anytime you or I play these 4 notes simultaneously, we can be confident we are playing an F7 chord, or better described as an F dominant 7th chord. Now let's look at an example of the major 7th chord that we've been talking about. This chord is identified by the major 7th abbreviation. That's quote MAJ7 on sheet music. Let's continue as before in looking at part 1. Here again it shows us that this is a G chord letter name, as well as being the G starting note of this chord example. Nothing new or different here. In part 2, because there is no single letter abbreviation immediately to the right of the chord letter, or because there is no capital letter M residing beside it, we can always assume it to be a major triad chord type, and it is. Again, nothing new or different here. For part 3, you need to know that this MAJ abbreviation is actually connected with the note position number 7, which identifies both the chord type, meaning the 7th chord type, and the note quality, meaning the note position number 7 note of the chord. And equally important, realize that this is major MAJ, or the MAJOR term does not represent the term major of the major triad chord type names. These are two different major terms used in different ways. Hopefully you are now familiar with the differences in these two types of 7th chords and can help pass this information along to your music friends. Thus, anytime you see the MAJ abbreviation in a chord name, you should consider it to be joined with whatever note position number that immediately follows that. Again, using semitone count numbers to form this 4-note chord, we see that the first note letter is a G note, the 0 semitone count, the 4 count is a B note, the 7 count is a D note, and the 11 count is an F sharp note. Thus, a G major 7th chord is formed with the notes G, B, D, and F sharp, no matter what octave I play them in. So no exceptions, and they never change. It's that simple. As we move towards the extended chord type examples of 9, 11, and 13th chords, let me first begin by pointing out that they also use the terms dominant and major in their chord names, similar to the 7th chords. In these chords, the term dominant, or DOM, is also dropped for brevity, thus leaving their chord names commonly abbreviated to just C9 or C11 or C13th or whatever, for example. And, like the dominant 7th chord, quote, extended dominant chords must also contain the flat 7 note position number, which is a semitone count number of 10, in addition to any other extended chord formula notes. For the major or the MAJ term in extended chords, understand that there are also major ninths, major 11th, and major 13th chords, all of which must contain the note position number 7 to make them an extended Maj chord, and includes any additional notes as identified in their respective chord formulas. So in summarizing in general terms, just know that the extended 9, 11, and 13 chords can either be named with a dominant chord quality or a major chord quality, along with the additional notes as defined by its chord formula. Now let's resume with a few more specific chord examples. This is an A minor dominant ninth, or shortened to an A minor 9, as you see in the slide. Notice this is an extended 5-note chord from our group 3 of chords. Looking at part 1, we see an A chord letter name, which is also obviously the starting note. Nothing new or different here. In part 2, the lowercase m identifies it to be a minor triad chord type. Nothing new or different here either. For part 3, the DOM abbreviation identifies it to be a dominant chord, and because it is an extended dominant chord, it requires using both the flat 7 note position note as well as then adding the 9th note position note as its name indicates. And we're adding those notes to the minor triad formula as you see here. Obviously, because it's a dominant type of chord quality, it must have the B7 note position number in it, which gives it its dominant quality. And then obviously the 9 note position number gives this chord its 9th chord quality. The semitone count numbers to form this 5-note chord begins with the first note with an A 0 count. The 3 count is a C note. The 7 count is an E note. The 10 count is a G note. And the 14th count is the B note. Thus, an A minor 9th chord is formed with the notes A, C, E, G, and B, no matter what octave I play them in. No exceptions, and they never change. Wow, it's that simple. Now, here's an example of a 6-note extended chord, that of a C sharp dominant 11th, or abbreviated C sharp 11th. As usual, part 1 tells us we have a C sharp chord letter name, as well as C sharp being the starting note. In part 2, we now know the absence of a letter here identifies it to be a major triad chord type. Nothing new or different. For part 3, with or without the DOM abbreviation, identifies it to be a dominant chord. And because this chord is extended to an 11 note position number, it obviously begins with its 3 triad note formula notes, and then adds 3 more notes to those, which is why it is a 6-note chord. Obviously, because it's a dominant chord, it's required to have the flat 7 note position note to make it dominant. Then it adds the 9 note position note to give it its 9th tone quality. And lastly, it must add the 11th note position note to give it its 11th note quality, as described in the name. So, putting all this together, the semitone count numbers formula to form this 6-note chord begins with a C sharp note, the 0 count. The F note is the 4 count. The G sharp note is the 7 count. The 10 count is the B note. The 14th count is the D sharp note. And the 17th count is the F sharp note. Thus, a C sharp dominant 11th, or just abbreviated C sharp 11th chord, is formed with the notes C sharp, F, G sharp, B, D sharp, and F sharp, no matter what octave we need to play them in. No exceptions, and they never change. How simple is this? But obviously, because this is a 6-note extended chord, you'll have to play at least with 2 hands to get things done there. By now, you may be getting bored with how easy this is, but let's do a few more chord naming examples before wrapping up. Now let's look at an F sharp major 13th chord. Part 1 tells us we have an F sharp chord letter name, as well as being the F sharp starting note, as we see. In part 2, we now know the absence of a letter identifies it to be a, quote, major triad chord type. Nothing new or different here. For part 3, the Maj abbreviation identifies it to be a major chord quality joined to an extended 13th note position number. Obviously, its chord formula begins with the triad notes and because it is a, quote, major quality extended chord, we must not only add the 7-note position note, we must add the 9-note position note, the 11-note position note, and lastly the 13th note position note as identified by its name. Obviously, this 7-note chord requires both hands to form and play. However, in the extended 11th and 13th chords, it is a generally accepted practice to omit certain notes. These omission notes are identified in my one-page, one-sided handout entitled Chord Types and Formulas, the best cheat sheet ever. But in this example of the 13th chord, it is acceptable to omit 2 note positions numbers, that is the 5-note position number and the 11-note position number. This helps reduce the muddiness of too many notes being played at the same time, as well as making it easier to form and play. Thus, the semitone count numbers begins with an F-sharp note, the 0 count. The 4 count is the A-sharp note. The 7 count is the C-sharp note, but you'll see we're going to omit that. The 10 count note is the F note, the 14th semitone count is G-sharp note, and then the 17th count is the B note, but we're going to omit that in a minute, and then the last is the 21 count D-sharp note. Thus, an F-sharp major 13th chord is formed with the notes F-sharp, A-sharp, C-sharp, F, G-sharp, the B note, and then lastly the D-sharp note. But we will omit the number 5 note position C-sharp note, and we will omit the number 11 B note. So we're left with the notes to play this chord are the F-sharp, A-sharp, F, G-sharp, and D-sharp. So now I hope you can see that complicated looking chords are really just simply following the chord formula semitone count numbers, no matter what chord letter name you want to play. Now let's look at a D minor 7th flat 5 altered chord. This chord name is an example from our group 4 of altered chords. We'll see in part 3 what part of the chord name makes this altered. But as usual, part 1 tells us we have a D chord letter name, as well as being the D starting note. Nothing new or different. In part 2, we see this to be a minor triad chord type. Nothing new or different here. For part 3, the number 7 identifies this to be a dominant 7th chord quality, thus requiring the flat 7 note as usual. But it is the flat 5 notation that is directing us to alter the original minor triad chord formula number 5 note position number to a flat 5 note position number, as seen in the adjusted chord formula. Generally speaking, altered chords are formed where some note or notes are modified by being sharpened or flattened from their original triad chord formula, which means there are no particular rules to follow. So technically, we could create our own altered chords if we thought the alterations that we were making sounded good. Again, no particular rules for altered chords. Although altered chords are not often used, here is an extreme example that refutes this. In the song, quote, Georgia on My Mind, written by Hoagy Carmichael back in the 30s, Ray Charles did his version of this song much later, which contains a total of 10 altered chords. There are 4 flat 5 chords, 2 sharp 5 chords, 1 sharp 9 chord, and 3 sharp 11th altered chords. Perhaps this is why this song and the artist is so revered and respected by musicians across the globe this many years later. Now back to our table. As you see, the semitone count numbers in this example begin with the 0 count of D, which is the D note. The 3 semitone count is the F note. The 6 semitone count is the G sharp note, and the 10 count is the C note. Thus, a D minor flat 5 chord is formed with the notes D, F, G sharp, and C. No matter what octave I play them in, no exceptions, and they never change. Again, it's that simple. In this example, that of a D diminished 7th chord, I'm showing this to illustrate illustrate that it is possible to have the same chord notes, but to have two different chord names. And if we compare this D diminished 7th chord to the previous slide of the D minor 7th flat 5 chord, we'll see that both of these chords, despite having two different names, actually have the same and include the same note letters to make the chord. As we see in part 1, it shows us we have the D chord letter name as well as the D starting note. Nothing new. In part 2, we see that it is a diminished triad chord. Again, nothing new. In part 3, the number 7 identifies this to be a, quote, dominant 7th chord quality, thus requiring the flat 7 note position note as usual. So when we break down these chord names, we see that we have the same notes as the D minor 7th flat 5 chord, but in this case come away with a different chord named D diminished 7th. And there are a few other examples out there, such as minor 7th chords that will have the same notes as 6 chords. So when you see these, you can choose whichever chord name that works for you and avoid heated debates over chord names. Thus, in this example, a D diminished chord is formed with the notes D, F, G sharp, and C, the same notes as the D minor 7th flat 5 chord we saw in the previous slide. So no matter what octave I play these chords in, there are no exceptions and they never change. It's that simple. So let's break down one more altered chord, that of a B dominant 11th sharp 5. As we see, part 1 shows us that we have a B chord letter name as well as being the B starting note. Nothing new. In part 2, in the absence of the word dominant or DOM, we assume it to be an extended major triad chord type, note position numbers 1, 3, and 5. Again, nothing new or different here. For part 3, the number 11 identifies this to be a dominant 11th chord quality, thus requiring the dominant quality flat 7 note, the 9 quality note position note, and of course the 11 quality note position note. In addition, we also see that we need to, quote, alter the original triad formula 5 note position note and make it a sharp 5 note. Thus, a B11 sharp 5, and that is a B dominant 11 sharp 5 chord, is formed with the notes B, D, G, A, C sharp, and E, no matter what octave I play them in. No exceptions, and they never change. Again, it's that simple. I know you're tired of hearing that, but hopefully you're getting the point. I hope you can now see what makes altered chords altered and how they are described as part of their chord name. Now let's look at a C add 9 chord. This add 9 chord was not one of the original chord types in our group of 4 that we had seen earlier, but it will now make more sense to learn it based upon the knowledge we gained previously. This is generically called an add chord. Let's check it out. So for any add chord, its chord name will reflect the note position note to be added to its triad chord formula. In the example we are viewing, it is the 9 note position number we're going to add. But what's different with add chords is that you do not have to include or need to include any previous notes of extended chords that you normally would. So looking at part 1, it shows us that we have a C chord letter note name as well as being the C starting note. Nothing new. Also, in part 2, there's nothing new. We see that this is a major triad chord type. And in part 3, as just mentioned, the number 9 identifies the note position number to be added to the 3 triad chord formula notes. In previous examples of 7th and extended chords, we had to include the dominant or major chord quality notes. But in the case of add chords, we only add that one note that is included in the chord name, whatever that note is, and that's a note position number, whatever that is, and we do that without regard to any other, quote, extended note protocols. So this is what makes this different than the extended chord types. The add chord is just adding that one note position note, whatever that is. Thus, in this example, a C add 9 chord is formed with the notes C, E, G, and D. no matter what octave I play them in, and no exceptions as they never change. Again, it's that simple. So now you know about C and you know specifically about add chords. So let's look at what we call a slash chord. In this example, I'm using a C/E. So although this is called a slash chord, it is not technically an official chord type. It is, however, a symbol, the slash symbol, that is used as a way to indicate a modification in the order or arrangement of the original root chord formula notes and how we play them. Because we see slash chords often, I wanted to include them now. So when we see one, it means that the note letter immediately following the slash is to be played first. Thus, this rearrangement of notes is just another way to create a, quote, different tone or sound while still being the same chord. However, slash chords can also be a way to introduce a single note that is not actually in the original chord formula notes to add some unexpected dissonance to the sound. But without getting too deep here, slash chords will be covered in depth in session 10 on chord inversions. For now, I just wanted to introduce the term slash chord, as you will see many varieties frequently on sheet music. As I begin closing this session on how chords are named, we can see an overview of the chord type groupings that we first saw in session 7. I do this in case you became overloaded with the 13 chord naming examples we just saw. Hopefully this overview will bring you back to a familiar place. So no matter how simple or advanced looking a chord name may initially appear, remember that all chords begin their life with some type of triad chord formula. Then, chord types are extended and or altered with other quality notes per their specific chord formula to create any number of tonal chord flavors. And remember too that chords are typically named from the root or start note appearing in its name, and the note could be any one of the possible 18 note names available. Now let me demonstrate the chord names we just decoded. I'll say the chord name, its chord formula note position numbers, its equivalent semitone count numbers, and lastly show you the notes to be played to make that chord. And I'm also going to show you another interesting aspect of how chords are formed, since you probably haven't observed these patterns thus far. Back in session 3, I introduced the two note interval names used most often in forming chords to be the minor third, which is abbreviated lowercase m3, and the major third note intervals, abbreviated with the uppercase M3. But I've intentionally waited to explain them because it would have been much harder to understand at that point. As you are about to see, the minor third note interval is a semitone count of 3, and the major third note interval is a semitone count of 4. Some music professionals refer to these, quote, third intervals as stacking thirds to form chords, although I still prefer semitone counting. Let's start at the home base of all chords, the C major triad chord that we have now seen many times. Again, remember most musicians simply call it a C chord. So the C major chord is formed with the note position numbers 1, 3, 5. That's the chord formula for a major chord, 1, 3, 5. I use semitone count numbers, so I'm going to call them 0, 4, 7, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And that's it. So the notes then of a C major triad chord or a C chord are C, E, and G. Now here's the new stuff about those minor and major intervals. When you look at the C chord and we go from the first note to the second note, then we see that that interval is 1, 2, 3, 4 is what we would call a major third interval. But then when we go from here to the last note or the third note of this chord, there's a 1, 2, 3. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, which is a major third interval. Then the next third is a minor third interval. So some people would look and say a major chord is a major interval, and then stacked on top of that is a minor third interval, a major third interval and a minor third interval. I don't want to beat this up, but it's another way to look at it. But as we now know, that is a C major chord, and most people just abbreviate and call it a C chord. Well, here's another that we talked about is an E minor. So we're going to obviously start with the E note, but our minor indicates that those triad notes and those note position numbers are a 1, flat 3, and 5. So when we look at the E minor chord, and we look at and in my world, I'm going to use 0, 3, and 7 as my semitone count number. So here's 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So that would be an E minor chord with the notes E, G, and B. Now let's take another one we saw in our example of a B diminished chord. I'm going to start with a B triad chord, and then when we look at the formula for a B diminished chord, or for a diminished chord, then we find it to be 1, flat 3, and flat 5 note position numbers. So to get that from our regular B diminished in this example, we're going to lower the second note and the third note from these positions down 1. So this would be the 1 note position number, flat 3 note position number, and the flat 5. For my world of semitone counting, I'm going to call it 0, 3, 6. 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So that would be a B diminished chord. And from a interval position, a third intervals, this would be a minor third interval, and then on up is another minor third interval. So a diminished chord has a minor third interval, and then stacked on top of that is another minor third interval. Notes B, D, and F for a B diminished chord. Then the last one that we can look at is a sus4 chord. Let's look at that D flat sus4 that we saw earlier. So our D flat note is here, and our chord formula for a sus4 chord is 1, 4, and 5. Note positions 1, 4, and 5. For my world, I'm going to do semitones, so that equates to a 0, 5, 7. So here's 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So these three notes would make a D flat sus4 chord. That's the note position numbers 1, 4, 5, or semitone counts 0, 5, 7. So that gives us a D flat note, G flat note, and an A flat note. So remember, 3-note triad chords are where all chords begin life, whether the chord type is a major, minor, diminished, augmented, or suspended. That's where they start. And now here's our last example of a chord that's called a slash chord that I introduced. Although remember, it's not a chord type, but it's just a way to indicate which note should be played first. So if we took a C/E chord, here's the C, but it's because it says the E note, it says we play the E note first, then we play the second note. So we would play an E slash chord with these notes of E, G, and then C. We could chart that and say that's a 3, 5, 1 note position note, because we've taken the 1 and we put it on top, or the 4, 7, 10 in semitone counts. Regardless of how you get there, we start with that, and then we just are it's directing us which note to play first. So in this case of a C/E slash chord, then is an E, G, and C notes. Let's now see the 4-note seventh chords. But before starting this demonstration, I'd like to share a quote application tip on how I approach forming seventh chords that's related to semitone counting. Here's the tip. As soon as I see a number 7 in some chord's name, I immediately process that to be a dominant seventh chord. And knowing this, I also know that it must contain the flat 7 note, which is semitone count number 10. So to quickly find this flat 7 note for the chord that I am forming, I count backwards 2 semitones from that chord's octave or 12th semitone count number, no matter what chord starting note is. So now we can use semitone counting method in another way. Let me illustrate. So let's use a C chord as the demonstration here, and actually we're going to use a C 7th chord. And so this is the B flat. The C note here, and its octave C note is up here. So if I'm playing in a chord that I don't normally play, I can just count backwards by 2, 1, 2, and at least I can quickly identify in this chord that is the 7th note. If we took a D chord and go back down 2, I know that note there added to the D chord, the D major chord, that makes a D7. Now typically I'm going to play it up here, and you can hear that 7th note there. But I'm using the semitone counts and the octaves of those. So if I'm at E, there's my E, and I count back so that I can immediately know that the D note with an E major chord is the flat 7 note, which is what we want to know. So that's a way I can use semitone counting. Now, when I see a major 7th notation in a chord's name, I immediately think of the 11 semitone count number. So if I saw on the sheet music it said play a C major 7th, I'm going to immediately play these 4 notes because I know that is the 11th semitone count. Or if I were at the octave, I just go down 1, and that's going to tell me immediately at least what that note is that I add to the triad that makes it and gives it that 7th flavor. So then when I play either of these 7th chords, I know with certainty that I am playing the correct 7th note in case another musician is not. It gives me great pleasure to know what I am doing is correct. So with this tip in mind, let me demonstrate our example 4-note 7th chords, beginning with the D minor 7th flat 5 that we saw earlier. By the way, these next 2 chords are those chords I showed you that actually have different chord names, but actually use the same note. So let me show you the D minor 7th flat 5. So here's a D minor, and that's got note position numbers 1, flat 3, flat 5, and then I'm going to add the 7th note, which is the C, so that would be a D minor 7th, and then it says to flatten the 5. So I'm going to now take this is the 5 note, so you can kind of see how I go and look at things from the basics. So that would be a D minor 7th flat 5, which has the notes D, F, G sharp or A flat, and C. So that's formed with note position number 1, flat 3, flat 5, flat 7, or in my semitone world of counting, 0, 3, 6, and 10. But as soon as I see that there's a 7th in that chord, I know immediately, and that's if it doesn't say a major 7th, I know it's a dominant 7th, which means it's the 10 semitone count. So that's an example of the D minor 7th flat 5. Now let's have a different chord name, but we're going to end up with the same notes. So let's take a D diminished 7th. So let's start with the D major, and then if we add the 7th note is here. But now it's a D diminished 7th. So to make a D diminished chord, I've got to have the flat 3 note and the flat 5 note along with the flat 7 note and then the original note here. So the D diminished 7th, D, ends up having the same notes as the D minor 7th flat 5. That's D minor 7th flat 5, or a D diminished 7th has the D, F, G sharp or A flat, and then the C is our flat 7 note in that. So that's kind of an interesting phenomenon. 2 different chord names, but actually use the same. So you can kind of take your pick. Not kind of, but you can take your pick of which chord name you want to call it. The last 7th chord is a major 7th that I'll demonstrate here. Notice that this is the chord, the major 7th chord is the chord that kind of has what I call the real number 7 note position number in it. So if we took a G major 7th, I know that major 7th note is going to be the true note, and its semitone count is 11. G major 7th are note positions 1, 3, 5, and 7, which is 0, 4, 7, and 11. That major 7th is indicating that it's the 11th semitone count, which in this example is the F sharp note. So the notes are G, B, D, and F sharp. Now, let's look at how those chords, or this particular chord, is stack of the major 3rd, then we're going to go a minor 3rd, and then we go back to a major 3rd interval, because we're going 0, 4, 7, 11. And then the last chord in this group of 4-note chords, we used earlier, the C Am9 chord. And the only thing special about that is that we're taking the C chord, the original triad, and all we're doing is adding the 9th note, which is actually a D. And what's different though about the add chord is using an add chord does not require you to put that flat 7 note in there. So that's the difference. The add chords are just put the note position number that appears in the chord name itself. And that would be where we are with add chords. Now, the last thing to conclude about 7th chords that maybe I haven't said in this way is that their respective note position numbers, the flat 7 in a C and the 7 note in a C example, they're special in that they continue to live in the extended 9, 11, and 13 chords. So another way to say that, any dominant 9th, 11th, or 13th chord must contain the flat 7, the semitone count number of 10, plus any other chord formula notes. And any major 9th or major 11th or major 13th chord must contain the 7 note position number or the semitone count number of 11 plus any other chord formula notes. This is why they are special, meaning this is why the 7th chords are special. And now here are the 5 and 6 note extended chord examples we saw earlier. I want you to notice how the flat 7 and the 7 notes are included as just mentioned, and how the minor third and the major third note interval patterns are being used. Let's start with the 5 note A minor 9th that we saw earlier. So if we took an A minor and we then are dealing with the 9th, which we know it to be because it doesn't say major 9th, that it's a dominant 9th. Therefore, chord formula for that in note position numbers is going to be 1, flat 3, 5, and then the flat 7 note is the G note in this example, and then the 9th note is the B. So this 5-note chord is an example of an A minor 9th. 1, flat 3, 5, flat 7, and 9. A, C, E, G, and B are the notes of an A minor. It's a beautiful chord. Now obviously, because it's 5 notes, it takes 2 hands, if you will, to play that conveniently. So in terms of the minor third and the major third intervals, we start out here 1, 2, 3, which is a minor third, 1, 2, 3, 4. Then we stack a 4th interval, and then 3 more is a minor third interval, and then we go 1, 2, 3, 4. So this note, this chord is actually minor third intervals, major third intervals stacked on that, another minor third interval on that, and then another stacking of 4th interval. It's a beautiful chord, A minor 9th. Now, a couple of examples of 6-note extended chords that we dealt with was a C sharp dominant 11th, or just abbreviated most of the time, just say a C sharp 11th. So in a C sharp dominant 11th, I'm showing here we've got a 1 note position 1, 3, 5, flat 7, 9, and 11, or in semitones a 0, 4 count, and then 7, that's 4, 5, 6, 7. And then we're going to 10, that's 7, 8, 9, 10. And then we're going from 10 to 14, there's 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. And then we're going to lastly end at 17, that's 14, 15, 16, 17. So it is these chords are the C sharp dominant 11th chord, that's a 0, 4, 7, 10, 14, and 17 notes. It takes 2 hands to play it, but it's a beautiful chord. But if we didn't have something to go by, we got all of these notes, 6 notes, and it would take a very keen ear to know any one of those is the right or wrong note to add in there. Okay, let's stop here with the F sharp major 13th extended chord. So we'll start here with the F sharp, and then we're going to call that semitone count 0, and then we're going to go to our next one is 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. And then we're going to go 4 to 7, 5, 6, 7. So we've got F sharp, A sharp, C sharp. Then we're going to go, because it's a major 13th, we've got to have the number 7 note position number, not the flat 7. So in this case, that's the 11. So right now we're at the 5. We're at semitone count number 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. So we're going to play that note, and then our number 9 note position note is going to be the G sharp, which is semitone count 14. So we're going from 11, 12, 13, 14, and then we're going to 17, 15, 16, 17. So the notes F sharp, A sharp, C sharp, F, G sharp, and B make up the F sharp major 13th chord, two-handed 6-note extended chord. Here's the last example, in this case a 6-note altered chord. We'll use the B dominant 11th sharp 5 chord as our example. Again, another 6-note chord, and in this case the note position numbers are 1, 3, and the reason that this chord is called an altered chord is that we're making the original 5-note position number a sharp 5, and that's in our chord name, as we can see, B dominant 11 sharp 5. So 1, 3, sharp 5, and then we're going to the last 3 notes are a B 7th, a 9th, and an 11th note. So let's get into it. Here's the B dominant 11th sharp 5 chord. So our first note is the B, and then in semitone counts it's going to be 0, 4, 8, 10, 14, and 17. So 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, which is the D sharp note. Now we're going to go to 8. That's 5, 6, 7, 8. That's the actual sharpened 5th, which gives it that dissonance. And then it kind of gets worse because this is a weird sounding chord. So then our flat 7 note is actually right next to it is the A note. Our 9th note is the C sharp. And then lastly, our 11th note to make this chord is the E. So it's these very weird sounding chord, which a lot of altered chords are. That's why they kind of in a class to themselves. So you could make up your own altered chord if indeed you thought that sounded good. So B 11 sharp 5 chord. So I hope you see how easy chords are named and how easy they can be formed using semitone count numbers, and why they are my preference and something I felt strongly about in sharing with you. Semitone counting has been a game changer for me in terms of forming and naming chords, and I hope it serves you well. In this session entitled Understanding How Chords Are Named, we have now seen how we can break down chords into 3 parts. And by analyzing chord names into manageable parts, it should help reduce anxiety and make chords appear less intimidating than they look to form and play. As you have seen, this analysis is a repeatable process, and with a little practice, this skill will help you become efficient in interpreting and forming the correct chord every time and with accuracy. At some point in your learning path, you should be able to look at any chord and have instant recognition of its name and how to form and play it. Unfortunately for the absolute beginner, this chord naming analysis process doesn't seem to be highlighted much by music teachers and therefore remains somewhat obscure, which is exactly why I wanted to cover it in this manner. And now, congratulations! You have achieved the primary goal of this 8-session learning series, How Chords Are Formed and Used for Absolute Beginners. Now you can consider yourself to be a true chordologist. I hope you enjoyed these sessions, and if these first 8 sessions prove to be successful for you, please subscribe as I have additional sessions in the work. Good luck, and I wish you continued success in your musical journey. And as always, thank you for your time and attention.